Hello, fellow communicators, and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a podcast that uses the communication theory coordinated management of meaning, what I'll refer to as CMM, to examine and reflect on how we build our relationships through storytelling and how we can do that better. As always, I'm your host, Abbie, and today we have part one of an incredible conversation with the Reverend Sara Hayden. Sara and I first met in 2018, and I actually spent a summer nannying for her two sons, who are just the cutest and most thoughtful kids you will ever meet. I love their family and have always known Sara to be a very intelligent and kind person. I think that as you join us in this conversation, you will find that she certainly proved me right here. This is a two-part conversation because we just had so many wonderful things to talk about together. Today, you will hear about living from imagination and creativity, the ever-elusive sense of enoughness, and emergent strategy. Hopefully, this can be an emotion and thought-provoking conversation for you. And at the very least, a glimpse into Sara's story. Thanks for joining Sara and I for this conversation. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told for another conversation episode. Today, we have joining us Sara Hayden. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Abbie.
And you are Reverend Sara Hayden. Do you like going by that official title or just Sara Hayden?
Oh, gosh. You can call me Sara, but yeah, Sara. I love that title.
The thing about that's weird for me is that, we'll talk about all your roles later, but I know you probably first as a mother to your children, but you have many different hats you wear.
Yeah, you definitely got to know our boys really well. And they still, your dog, actually, Rexy, is still their favorite animal on the planet.
That's good to know. I was wondering if they'd forgotten about me yet, but as long as they remember
loom
Rex.
large. Oh, yeah, you loom large. Yes.
That's good. That's good. All right. So my first question I want to give a little context for. I heard this question when I was first on a call with some people that are involved with the CMM Institute. And I thought it was an incredible question. It's how are you arriving to this conversation today? Because I just feel like we don't always take into account where people are coming from, how they're greeting us or meeting us, what they're bringing to the conversation with them. But one of the people that is also another CMM person who lives in Australia pointed out to me that when she heard me ask that question in a different conversation, she thought it was like a weird question because just the language, because she pointed out that, well, if you're arriving, then you've never actually arrived. So just pointing out that it was maybe a strange question, but for us, I hope you can pick up on what I'm meaning by this when I say, how are you arriving to this conversation today?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because we tend in the groups that I lead to do some sort of unpacking and helping people enter the space intentionally. So I love the question. I would say for me, I am arriving energized, yet unsettled. Not by the conversation, but
sure.
I find myself in a time period of reflection where I'm doing more of a season of deep dive around meaning and vocation and the role of the organizations I work for in being active in the world that we're a part of now. So energized by that work, but not clear yet the way it will manifest itself.
Right. Maybe it's good to be unsettled sometimes.
Yeah, it's good to remind ourselves that it's good to be unsettled.
Right. You have
That's
to tell
a part
yourself.
of the process. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll share that I am arriving to this conversation today. Maybe the word is distracted because I am a little jet lag, having just arrived in Spain yesterday. But I'm very excited to be doing this work. And the more I've worked on the podcast, I just feel more and more grateful and amazed that this is what I get to do. And I love doing it. And so
You're so good at it.
Thanks, Sara. I'm bringing that energy to you in this conversation today.
Thank you. And yeah, we might end up with a part 2 where Abbie gets a nap in between.
Abbie gets a nap. That sounds great.
Abbie has slept part 2.
Yes. So what I then want to go to is, instead of me trying to say, here's my guest, here's your bio that you maybe have written or not. Here's a list of accomplishments or however you might measure that. I would like for you to tell us who you are. And the way I want to word that through the lens of CMM is, what is the story that you are telling about yourself?
I want to admit that it's much easier for me to host conversations about other people than to talk about myself.
Oh, yeah.
So even though I'm used to speaking in front of groups as a pastor, I find it much more intimate, certainly, to find the words to talk about my own journey.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's necessarily true across the board for anyone in a particular vocation. But for me, I had to think about it like, oh gosh, Abbie's going to ask me about myself.
Yeah, usually you're the one on this end of the conversation.
Right. There's a vulnerability to it.
Mm-hmm.
And, a sense of like, once you unleash and tell this story, this precious thing about yourself is out there for people to judge or make their own meaning about. But as you've said on the podcast, the depth of relationship also can come from that.
Yes.
So I will do it.
Yeah, I think the vulnerability is a scary thing, but I think a necessary thing. I think absolutely a brave thing.
Yeah. I would say, just looking back at my life, that I have always been someone who is drawn to things that don't exist yet, or types of communities that are in the process of unfolding. For example, I grew up in Kansas City. A lot of people think that's a place like surrounded by weed and empty fields. And actually, the church that I was first a part of grew out of a Sunday school classroom meeting in a cafeteria, that became a church building and large community in a field in Kansas. I was the kid who I would set up little businesses, even for my family members. Like, I try to find something to sell in my bedroom and like set up a little table in the hallway. My sister would be like, oh, she's selling stuff again.
That's a whole new level. I mean, I was pretty big on lemonade stands, but right in your own hallway.
Right. Or like, oh, okay. I remember when I was in college studying abroad in Havana, Cuba, that a lot of my compatriots there would say like, could we do something like this? And would look to me for that. And that was just a very natural relationship that I found myself in all kinds of different communities, whether it was college or in high school, kind of standing slightly apart from a member in a community or in a clique. One of the realities of that was that I would often be friends with a lot of different people, but not necessarily have my one group.
Yeah.
When I was speaking with my mom, I was actually visiting my parents a couple of weeks ago and had the chance for lots of long conversations. My mom said something to me that was really significant and lovely. She actually has mild cognitive impairment, so she's kind of early in the stages of Alzheimer's, but she can remember things and communicate them on a really deep level about someone's history. And one of the things she said to me was, I had this vision when I was singing in choir. You were at the podium, which I would call a pulpit, and she normally would, but the word for her in her mind was, you were at the podium. And I saw you doing the talk, the sermon, doing the talk. And I noticed what you were doing was not just talking, but you were trying to connect people to each other. And I was like, oh my gosh, Mom, like
wow.
That, when I look back at my work organizing and mobilizing, in particular, a movement of folks who were starting out new communities of faith together in really diverse ways, I see myself always trying to connect people to each other. So in the process of leading worship, which might include someone talking up front and other people just listening, and I'm kind of like sharing information, that's not the aim to me. That's not the focus. It's more about creating community and allowing people to connect deeply with each other and with the Spirit.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when growing up at, the church that we've both been to now, my favorite part were when I got to be a part of the conversation. Of course, as a kid, it's hard to just sit there in the pews and sit still and not super boring. Be distracted. Right. It can be. And so when you get to actually engage with a conversation, I think that's so meaningful.
Yeah, it's a way that we enter in and see ourselves, our presence there. How do we choose how to contribute? And I always say to the groups that I lead, like, thank you for being here. How we all choose to interact will create the space and the community that we want to intentionally bring into being. So it's not me saying, here's what we're doing and here's who we'll be. We're creating that in a collective way.
Yeah. I mean, even the way you're talking about a sermon, a church worship service is the same reason that I'm trying to be very careful about the language I use with the podcast, is that I want to call it a conversation and not an interview. Because if the interview, like a sermon, maybe is one-sided, that's not like realistic for how we actually communicate with people in our day-to-day life. And so I think there's value in that, but I think there's a lot different value in the back and forth of conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You said that in maybe some of these different groups, people turn to you to say, you know, what could we do next? And you said that that's a role you've had of looking towards things that do not yet exist. Do you feel like that's a role that other people put you in, or you kind of chose for yourself?
You know, hindsight, they say, is 20/20, right? I look back and I see that being a part of early childhood for me. I remember actually being friends with someone in the neighborhood who was a kid who was a little bit outcast. And for me, Kelsey was like the most fun person in the neighborhood. And it hit right at that developmental stage where I wasn't thwarted by, you know, the hope of popularity or something like that. It was probably like third or fourth grade. You know, it just didn't matter. And I also think that's why I wanted to study abroad in Cuba in particular, because I felt that there are certain situations in the world where in particular communities were told more about how something is and expected to believe that, rather than being invited to be in a interactive relationship with it. So for example, I studied public policy on the Helms-Burton embargo, the US embargo on Cuba. And I found that all the materials I had were from US policy makers.
Right.
I couldn't access how the Republic of Cuba felt about that, or ordinary Cuban citizens. It was like,
which is an important part of the story.
It's an important part of the story. Yes. And so there is that drive. To me, that is a thin place. That is a moment when I personally have chosen to do those things, when I feel, okay, I'm here for a reason. I feel a sense of vocational clarity, in the sense of like being, the religious language would be to use and say, I feel called to be here. I feel called to be in this relationship, which you could use whether you're religious or not.
Right.
But that's the, you know, perspective that is common in my own Reformed Christian theological tradition.
Any more about your story about yourself?
Oh, gosh. It's interesting to be asked that, because I think, you know, you kind of wonder when someone asks you, like, how much are other people telling Abbie in these interviews? Or what's the appropriate amount that doesn't feel like oversharing?
Right. Part of it is that I do think that people need to kind of earn your vulnerability or the right to hear your story. And so that's hard, because maybe our relationship is one thing, but you don't know who all's listening to this podcast. And so you don't have a specific relationship with them to trust people with your story, because it is a vulnerable thing. But I think there's no right or wrong way to do it, especially because how I word the question goes back to one of the very core points of CMM, is that there's this tension usually between our lived stories and our told stories. And it's not that that's a bad thing. It's just true that we're assigning meaning from the beginning, because what we live is going to change a little bit between what's lived and then what's told about what we live. And so I think I resonate with that a lot, because I always have put a lot of stock in what other people have told me about myself and let other people define me. But that's something I'm trying to move away from. And so what the story I'm telling about myself, that's not going to be a right story or a wrong story. It's just going to be the story that I happen to be telling about myself right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about, for me, often the story feels easier to tell if I can say today, this is the story I tell about myself, or in this season. But I think as humans, we also yearn to have the story of ourselves be a collective story of our, birth to this point now. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Let me think. Is there anything in particular you would want to know?
No, that's okay. I just wanted to give you the space to say any more since I kind of asked a couple questions leading us in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a powerful question too. Sometimes the simplest questions are the most powerful. Thinking about one of the things I do in my work is executive coaching. And a general rule ethically is to, as the coach, be speaking no more than 20% of the time. And a lot of times the more significant follow-up questions that unlock something for someone else is to say, that's interesting. What else? Which feels like such a easy,
my favorite is
question.
Tell me more.
Tell me more. Yeah. And boy, it's fascinating what unfolds for people in that process of being listened to deeply and asked what else. But yeah, that feels like enough for me right now. Good. But I'm interested as the conversation progresses, I'm sure more will come to mind for me.
Absolutely. We'll get to it because the second thing I want to ask then is, again, just from your perspective, what do you see is the story that other people are telling about you?
I related when you said a moment ago, you referenced telling your own story versus allowing other people to tell your story for you. And I think one of the things, having grown up in a predominantly white suburban school system, for example, that drive to create a certain report card image, a certain biographical image of yourself, I see that struggle among teens today that often manifests itself in mental health crises or depression, of the sense of you can be anything you want to be, which was a gift of my particular generation, just on the tails of Gen X, telling young women in my context, one thing I heard was, you can be anything you want to be. My mom, for example, was my sports coach in volleyball, in softball, in basketball. She was often the only woman coaching even the girls' sports at the time. And she was one of a few mothers I knew in my particular context, my particular cultural context, who worked full-time outside of the home. And I was super proud of her for that. And
that was not the majority of mothers.
That's the story I tell myself, I suppose. Yeah. And thinking that I don't actually think that's true, but sometimes it felt that way.
Yeah.
And I think in those instances, what I also learned was it was okay to do things that typically girls were not doing professionally.
Right.
You can be the sports coach. You can be the president of the United States. The burden that comes from that, you can do anything you want to do, is that when we grow up, we find out that's not actually true.
Right.
Or, the pressure we might put on ourselves, those of us who grew up hearing that message, that you could do anything you want to do equals you should want to do anything you can do. Or you can do anything you want to do. You should do everything that you can possibly do. And so that incessant striving, to me, I'm in a place where I can stand back and interrogate that a little more. What did that mean? And what story do I choose to live into around that message that formed and informed a large part of my own high school, college, graduate school, and beyond experience?
It feels like maybe a little bit of an overcorrection from, women being told you're not capable of this, you're not allowed to do this, to women can have it all, is the kind of, saying you can have it all implies all the things you're talking about, that you should want to have it all and you have to strive, like you were saying, rather than just having what you want to have.
Yeah. And what does enough look like? And what, the deeper reflection on what enough means as a human citizen, as a community member, as a relative, as a friend. And I find much more abundance in the enoughness, in the
Mm-hmm.
sufficiency, and the discipline of, commitment to sufficiency, rather than just striving, one person at the top, which is a lonely place to be.
Yeah.
And, certainly comes with its own limitation of perspective.
Yeah, I like Brene Brown a lot, and she talks about the difference between coming from a place of scarcity and a place of abundance, regardless of what you actually have. But having that perspective changes everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. I have some good friends who grew up on the continent of Africa. One friend in particular, my colleague Gad, introduced me to the Zulu philosophy of Ubuntu, which is, could be translated as I am because we are, therefore I am. And the who I am must be defined in relationship to the larger community and vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. Therefore, I can't extract my story from the people I'm in relationship. And to do so would be, at best, a limited perspective.
Right. Well, that's why I asked too, what is the story that other people are telling about you? Because I think our relationships are a big part of what define us. And like you're saying, you can't extract the story about yourself from other people's relationships to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very interesting question for Americans, and in particular, white Americans, I think, because my perspective is that we're often taught or expected to self-differentiate rather than to see ourselves in relation to community. So I am curious to use CMM in a way that allows us to listen more deeply to the stories behind the white American story, for example, or like kind of American idealism.
You're getting at it exactly, because part of CMM is pointing out and paying attention to whose stories are being told and whose are not, whose are being listened to when they are told, who have the space to tell the stories. And the name of the CMM Institute is the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. And so that's part of what you even were getting at, of you can't extract the individual from the social world that they're a part of, to use the language of CMM. And it requires, if we're getting into this world and hoping for and working towards things that are not yet real, like you've talked about, we have hope for better social worlds, then you need both the personal and the social evolution.
Yeah, right. Well, one of the things that you were just speaking about made me think of a practice that I've recently started observing in groups called the Circle Way, which is an indigenous concept and is certainly been around since, I would imagine, since the time people have gathered to make decisions and to relate to each other. Many of us have the picture of people sitting in the evening and the twilight hours around a fire. You can speak into that time or you can sit in silence, but there's a slowness and an attention, observed attention around the collection of people being in a circle together. And the shape is important because in the center of a circle, in the Circle Way, are placed our collective hopes and stories, our objects of meaning, our symbol. So that when I speak to you, if you were across the circle from me, I would be speaking into the circle. And you would also be speaking into the circle. And the image that is observed by anthropologists and sociologists is like, I'm not slinging an arrow at you to disagree with you, or, just for one person to collect. The comments that I make and the stories that I tell and you or anyone else create collective meaning into that space and can be seen by all and also picked up by all. So what you might say in the Circle Way is, I'd like to pick up the piece. And you speak for yourself, but you place your piece back into the circle, allowing that to create meaning And someone else in the circle might say, I'd like to pause here and just acknowledge that to me, it feels as though something really important was just shared. Can we just observe a moment of silence? Which is very different than how we've rehearsed from young children onward in the practice of conversation.
What we call basically what you're talking about in some of my communication, we talk about the pool of shared meaning. Because, when we talk about making meaning, there's this very personal element where things, even if you and I experience the same thing, I'll attach different meaning to it than you will. But when we are communicating, we're all putting into this pool of shared meaning, and it's ever changing. You asked if I had heard of emergent strategy, and I did some reading on it, but I wonder if you could talk about emergent strategy, because that seems to have to do with adapting and that the way that meaning and our lives and our world are always changing. Yeah.
It's something that I've played a little bit with and resonates with me as someone who creates meaning in community or observes meaning, works with collectives of individuals, especially, we've seen this much more during the pandemic, like everyone's living their lives. And then there's our Zoom life where we talk to each other. And but then, the second I hit end to a Zoom recording, I'm off. Anything that happens to me in that moment might be like the dog comes up and needs to go on a walk, or I receive a difficult phone call and message, or any number of things, right? Adrienne Maree Brown in her book, Emergent Strategy, calls these fractals, these moments in time that are experienced by human beings. And it's almost like striking a match. Like if you and I were to have something happen to us, like on a walk through our neighborhood, the meaning, the effect of that event would come with us into the next relationship or the next event. It becomes, in a sense, a part of us, which to me is a very honest way of examining the relationships between people, rather than assuming that like we come like blank slates into conversations, into dinner parties, into services of worship, into classrooms. We're not even born sealed in plastic bags, hypoallergenically, right?
From the minute you come out, you're receiving all of these messages or whatever you want to say. Like, they say babies see and take in so much, whether we realize it. But that's like why it's important to think about how you're showing up to a conversation, because no one is a blank slate.
Yeah. It's interesting to consider whether this is a concept that human beings are wrestling with in a different way than we have before, or whether we're starting to step back as, say, Americans living in late stage capitalism, post-enlightenment, and say, I want to think more about relationships and meaning. That might have been something very intuitive to our ancestors in a way that it was, or certain ancestors and families, in a way that feels rather complex or jarring to us.
Yeah, we've gotten really distanced from some of those things, the community.
Yeah. So you could say that a movement, for example, is progressed and enlarged by participating collectively in certain events. Hey, let's come to this rally, and then let's go to the next rally, and let's pass it on. And there's an element of that. But movements are also created and shaped by the individual circumstances in which human beings interact with each other and the places in which we do that.
Is that mainly where you see or you think about emergent strategy is around social justice movements?
I could see it shaping in a lot of ways. Probably what I should do is say, I don't know that this is what Adrienne Maree Brown would intend, and I'll just speak about the concept in general. So I have a neighborhood that's fairly small. I think there's like 30 households in the neighborhood, maybe fewer. And I remember one of my neighbors whose name is Everett, and he's like the cutest kindergartner in the world until my son goes to kindergarten next year. But he became enamored last year in gardening and was really drawn. I think he was bored. He got out of school earlier than the other kids and was allowed to kind of roam the neighborhood and talk to whoever he wanted. He's definitely a kid who's a problem-solving kid and an extrovert looking for companionship. So he would ring the doorbell all the time and I work from home a lot of times. So he would see me in through the window in my office and just kind of, I think, come up with some sort of random reason to ask me something for attention, which I grew to love in a sense. Like I'm in a business meeting or, I'm in leading something online and the doorbell rings and he sees me and I see him and I can't just leave him hanging. I think for kids in general, it's a very weird time where for my kids who are 5 and 8, they think like work is what you and I are doing right now, which we're in a Zoom with some headsets and recording, and we're looking at each other and we're saying things to each other. They're like, well, that's what work is. And
that's
in a
all
sense,
they know.
They're right. I mean, those are major activities of what I spend time doing while I'm working, but it's not the purpose of the work. It's just a modality. And for Everett, I don't think he understands that I'm working just because I have this headset on and then I'm like talking into a computer, or maybe he doesn't care. But he'd ask me things like, hey, how many more sleeps is it until Halloween? It's just hilarious. Or like, can I see the pumpkins we're growing? And, he would, with great attention, walk around the garden and help me garden sometimes. And I was just thinking about your question of emergent strategy and how it relates to social justice. It really does. Like these fractals are much smaller. The meaning making and the social progression or the change we want to see in the world is much more tangible, immediate, conversational, sort of one-offs than the large assembly people, the large assemblies that we observe together. And it's easy to think with social media or watching the news or scrolling through Instagram that this big thing that happened is going to determine our future. But I do believe it's those moments of like, how do I receive Everett when he knocks on the door? What message do I communicate to this 6-year-old when he's seeking attention? Not to say that he can always interrupt me or like, that I'm always got time for him in that moment. But I think of this like deep care and respect for my relationship with this young neighbor, hopefully is something that he takes with him, that he realizes he and his interactions are valued and important and help shape meaning as well. So if he goes back on his little, like he has a little battery powered motorcycle, it's lime green. When he goes back on his motorcycle and like puts his helmet on, like how does he feel when he does that? And the next person he encounters, does he see himself as someone who's worthy of being seen and given attention to? Because a lot of the problems and violence we know comes from this sense of not being seen, not being wanted, not feeling valued.
Yeah. I think, I keep saying this, but it's interesting to hear everything you're saying. And then for me, we're talking about the same thing, but maybe we have different language based around it, based on our, what our areas of expertise. But in CMM, at least what you're talking about is a bifurcation point of maybe there's a major event and who knows which way it's going to go. We have the choice to respond because, like you've said, we're participants. We're not observers in the social world we're a part of. We are active participants. We're shaping it. It is shaping us right back. And I think about what you said in terms of every institution that exists is made up of human beings. And so that's why it's deeply relational. It is deeply personal to do the work of fighting some oppressive systems, all oppressive systems that exist. It's a deeply personal and relational thing, because if relationships don't exist, that's why, at least in the United States, we're so polarized politically because there's such a lack of relationship and conversation and respect between the two sides, the exchange of ideas.
Yes. Yes. When it becomes personal, change happens. And it's very, I think, difficult for people to understand why a policy affects them until it does. I mean, that's a kind of dumb thing to say, but when you find out, oh, my nephew is gay, I didn't realize that, and now I do care about the policies that protect and honor the lives of LGBTQIA people. It's personal now because I love this person, and their embodiment, their relationship with me has fundamentally transformed the way I see something that is written on a piece of paper saying what we should or should not do and how we relate.
Yeah. We've talked about, different people not having the space to share their stories societally, culturally, maybe their voices not being privileged. I wonder, considering all of your identities or roles, do you feel like growing up, you received messages that made you feel safe to tell your story? Or I wonder if you also received some messages about not able to tell your full story.
So my sister is gay, Katie. She's the best person I know. She and her wife, Cece, have 3 beautiful boys who came into our family through the foster system as infants, but have always been a part of our family. And I remember as a child thinking, in particular, that my sister was braver than I was, but yet I saw myself as my sister's keeper, which I should. Siblings, brothers and sisters at their best, we look out for each other.
Right.
But I always wondered, there came a point in a lot of relationships that I had, for a variety of reasons. We also look very different. When people would say, "Who's that?" I'd say, "That's my sister." And the subtext of their response was like, "Really? That's your sister?" Made me, what I intuited from that response in the way, either it was an intentional response or you would have the language around this, CMM.
Right.
What was the story told? What was the untold story from them? But what I intuited from that was like, I can't believe you guys are related, or I'm surprised that you're sisters based on a visual cue of a photo, or later on when we were teenagers and adults, the fact that she was gay. And I remember also, it was a litmus test for me in a lot of ways. It's like, how far do I go in this relationship, depending on the person's reaction to my beloved sister?
Right.
Because there are times I think all activists, let me just not say all activists, but as human beings, more broadly speaking, we decide how much we want to invest in a relationship. So if someone that we're interested in knowing or we feel a sense of kinship towards says something like, very ugly things.
Yeah, fill in the blank with whatever.
Like, God hates these people. And of course, this is my perspective on the world as a theologian. Who is God for and against? How should we be or should not be? What's allowed and what's not allowed as a diverse human community? It's sort of like I have this decision point of, do I tell this story? Because a lot of times that story of like, it invites wondering, like, oh, your sister's, and she has kids and she's married, especially before the change in legalization of marriage from across the board in the United States and in other countries. It was a very surprising thing. So those stories being told, or me telling my sister's story, but it is also my story. And I think them knowing me, I always wish that someone would know me quite deeply in a lot of ways before I shared the story. Because if I interacted with someone and had a sign that's like, my sister's gay, ask me about it, it would be one type of conversation. But if it's like someone you've spent, let's say we've been coaching basketball together for an entire semester, and they come over to my house for a party and they pick up a photo and say, "Who's this?" And I say, "Oh, that's my sister and her wife and their boys." Probably invites a different kind of conversation and hopefully a deepening of the relationship. and an acknowledgement from that person of either like, oh, that's great. The signifiers we receive, right? Like this is okay with them, not unexpected, or this is new and they have questions, or you can see people sometimes trying to square like, I like this person. I know she's a pastor. I believed certain things about her because of her, title or ordination. And now I am perplexed. I don't understand how those things go together.
Right. There's a new piece of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. They don't know where to put it. Mm-hmm. Everything you're saying to me, I feel like I'm hearing through the lens of expectations, because not to say that people shouldn't have any expectations, but it's again about letting things emerge and adapting and letting yourself go with the flow of the social world that you're in, because maybe people don't have the expectation that your sister is gay. That's just not something they knew about you, whether they thought about it or not at all. But
what is normative and what's not normative.
Exactly. Right. And so it's then up to them to, even if it's unexpected for everyone across the board, you could respond with like a kind curiosity. Because you could say, oh, your sister's gay, or oh, your sister's gay, like just a new piece of information, and you keep moving right along. When you're so stuck in your expectations is when you're not able to do that. Yeah. And I feel like that's maybe where some people are coming from. And I think I would react the same way, that it is a good marker almost of, okay, if you're not able to move through this new piece of information, or you have your own thoughts about whether it's quote unquote right or wrong, then that's maybe telling of the kind of person they are, the kind of relationship you might be able to have with them or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the intention, I think, in some ways behind the emergent strategy piece is that that person might hear that first from me and walk away quizzically, or it's like wake up in the middle of the night thinking like, that makes me uncomfortable, or I don't understand this, or I'm angry, or pondering different things. The next time it happens, or in a different way, in a different situation, they are putting these pieces together that inform the way they relate to the world. And I think there's ways in which we can use language to help people like boundary their behavior, obviously. I'm curious what you think about this, Abbie, because it came to mind for me. Can I tell a story?
Please.
Okay. So one of the first jobs I had as a minister was working as a chaplain in a hospital, which had a trauma hospital, but also had long-term acute care facilities. And I would go be called into situations to respond to, but also visit staff and patients and their families on a regular basis. One of the situations that occurred, this is probably 16 years ago, I still remember it. A caregiver spouse of a patient who was evidently brought to the emergency room due to a situation of domestic violence was removed from the hospital against medical orders. They call that AMA by the spouse. The spouse told the person who was expecting a child at the time, we're leaving, you got to get out of here. And the staff was, of course, reeling from this situation in particular. How could we have better prevented the violence against this patient, protected them and their rights, knowing that there was a very precarious situation in terms of how that communication happened. Ultimately, they left, and we don't know, how their situation was treated and what kind of support she had as a patient or as someone healing from something. I remember a couple of weeks ago seeing a sign at a different hospital in a different city. This is 15 years later. So I was visiting my dad who was having a surgery. And on the wall of the inpatient unit was a sign that said, "A safe place for healing. We have zero tolerance for violence. The University of Kansas health system is committed to providing a safe environment for patients, visitors, and staff. We will not tolerate violent or aggressive behavior of any kind, including," and they list several things, including some of the things that I had observed 15 years ago as a chaplain in another major medical facility. If necessary, we will notify the police and this may result in prosecution. Thank you for your respect. So that kind of a language, I find so often that statements and rules and legislation doesn't come out of a perspective or intent to protect the innocent, but rather to satisfy the norm or to project the norm. And in this case, this was an unequivocal statement denouncing violence of any kind, staff, it included everyone, staff, patients, visitors, volunteers. But it also left me with a lot of hope in general about how we as institutions and communities might use language to help people imagine a better way forward. So rather than, and it says, we watch the police or we call the police if we see something suspicious in our neighborhood, put the sign in the front of the neighborhood. And you know what kind of neighborhood that goes in.
Yep.
What kind of language would be deeper, broader, more hopeful, more inclusive? And I think kids especially, and folks who have grown up with a very different relationship toward language, growing up with social media, cell phones, the ever-present messaging, have real resources in their person and in their communities as to how to do that creatively. I mean, I would think so. You grow up with social media, you can constantly message. The goal is not to be on your phone all the time, but I think one of the gifts of that experience, not being someone from that particular generation, this is like, of course we can create worlds with our language. Of course we can create expectations. It doesn't have to be a standard sign. It doesn't have to be the same thing that we stake here and everywhere else just because it's been there in that neighborhood for the last 50 years.
Right. I fully believe that, language is so powerful because being able to name something, like you're saying, like if we can say, okay, we call the police in this neighborhood if suspicious or whatever activities. If you can say, okay, like what's the emotion going on there? What message are we really trying to convey? Yeah. I think it's maybe seems so tedious, but every word is so important because there's layers of meaning behind it. The same way, again, and the meaning that we put to it is that a word will have a different meaning for you than it might for me, even if we have a shared literal definition. Because I think like vulnerability is one of my favorite words, concepts. I always want to be leaning into moments of vulnerability. I don't do that perfectly all the time, but I have a very positive almost connotation of vulnerability. Even though it's a hard thing, I think it's a brave thing and a worthwhile thing. Whereas other people have wholly negative connotations around the concept of vulnerability. And again, neither right or wrong, but it's power to think about how you relate to different words in the language that you do choose to use because it is a choice. Absolutely. I'd love to take those signs down in my neighborhood and invite folks to a conversation in my living room and say, can I borrow this sign? To invite different folks anonymously, not in my living room or collectively, if folks agree to that level of vulnerability, to say, what was the feeling evoked in you when you first read that sign? What comes to mind, from your past experiences that's evoked from reading this language? What might it tell you about the community you belong to and whether you belong in this community? Because I suspect that we have very different reactions to that sign. And it might be that everybody hates it just like I do and no one's examining it. Yeah. Or ask a child, does it evoke unnecessary fear in them and lack of action? I think that it would be fascinating to tell stories around that kind of a thing. What is the goal we actually have here? Does this align with it? If it's safety and it's secure, it's a sense of safety in this place and inclusion, then does this sign actually serve that purpose? Maybe it did at one point. Maybe we had a different goal.
Right. And what's more important? And, sometimes we have to make decisions about whether inclusion fosters safety rather than exclusion or vigilance.
Mm-hmm. Well, you even said, talking about the kid in your neighborhood growing up that you just thought was the coolest and you wanted to be friends with before you were poisoned with popularity and fitting in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's true for a lot of adults who were not raised the way I hope and I see more children being raised with this more empathetic, inclusive language, is that those kids who were exclusive grew into adults who are exclusive. And so like in the United States, at least, like it's a very exclusive society. It's about othering people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's going back to those social justice movements. Again, every movement, institution, system being created by people who are just people who are probably mostly hurting. And so maybe creating more hurt and then hurt people who want to actually do something productive with that feeling. And it's just people.
Mm-hmm.